I am pleased and honored to introduce our third speaker, Andrew Bozio, who is associate... Did I do it wrong again? I have been practicing. I know him very well, and suddenly today have just not... Bozio. Andrew Bozio, who is associate professor of English at Skidmore College. He is the author of Thinking Through Place on the Early Modern English Stage, published by Oxford in 2020. This rich and beautiful work discusses Marlowe, Shakespeare, Beaumont, and Ben Jonson, and investigates both how early modern characters negotiate their physical and environmental surroundings as represented across numerous plays, as well as the way in which the playgoing experience and the negotiation of those theatrical and city landscapes can also serve as a vehicle through which readers now can better understand the places and key spaces of early modern England. Alongside Penelope Gung, Dr. Bozio is the co-editor of a special issue of the Journal for Early Modern Cultural Studies on disability and racial capitalism in the early modern Anglophone world, which is forthcoming in 2026. And his essays and articles have appeared in numerous journals like Modern Philology, Studies in Philology, and Shakespeare Studies. And his wonderful research has been supported by the Folger Shakespeare Library, the Huntington Library, the Newberry Library, and the Race Before Race Second Book Institute. He is currently working on 2 monographs. The first, titled Scenes of Dispossession, English Theater and the Aesthetics of Racial Capitalism, traces the development of racialized logics of dispossession and accumulation across the early modern Anglophone world. It argues that theater helped to translate those logics into a kind of common sense over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries. Theater transformed racial capitalism into an aesthetic, as he puts it, and a way of seeing and feeling within the world, and was therefore crucial to the historical process by which, quote, capitalism ceased to be simply a system of production and became a whole form of social life, in the words of Stuart Hall. However, his talk for us today draws from a different monograph in progress. This one, prospectively titled Settler Ability. Settler ability theorizes the centrality of disability to settler colonialism through a comparative study of Spanish and English imperialism in the 16th and 17th centuries. This book will show how forms of impairment were strategically attributed to or inflicted upon indigenous peoples as a means of justifying and sustaining the colonial project. Settler ability will show how mass impairment and debilitation shaped the histories of Spanish and English conquest, from Columbus's first voyages through the conquests of Mexico and Peru to England's occupation of Ireland and the expansion of those colonial efforts to Virginia, Massachusetts, and Barbados. And this book will trace the disabling and debilitation of indigenous peoples, and it argues that settler colonialism served to capacitate, which, as he puts it, is to empower and enable Spanish and English settlers. It will study how the fiction of indigenous impairment worked to establish the complementary fiction of settler ability, the belief that white settlers were inherently more capable than the indigenous peoples they sought to dispossess. So this book will establish how these fictions of indigenous impairment and settler ability became realized in the etymological sense of making real through the colonial venture. So this is a wonderful and a really exciting contribution to pre-modern race-making, and I'm sure of it, and I'm so glad that today we have the opportunity to hear about it more in the talk, Settler Ability circa 1600. So let's please give a warm welcome to Dr. Bozio.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alani, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to start by thanking Alani for the invitation to come and speak here today, to Alani, to Rachel, to Ben, to everyone at the Cogut Institute for all the hard work in making this happen. This is really exciting. And as Alani suggested, or actually I'm going to ad-lib a little bit here, I didn't realize that the talk I'm about to give was the foundation of the third book until I was in the middle of writing it, and it just occurred to me that there's so much to deal with here that it really is going to require an entire monograph. So it's simply a way of saying this has already had major consequences for my research trajectory. There should be access copies, so I hope everyone who needs one, good people are nodding. Fabulous. In that case, without further ado. In a device made by the Earl of Essex for the entertainment of the Queen, an Indian prince travels from the great river of the Amazons to the English court. An ancient prophecy asserts that it should be he that should expel the English, or the Castilians, a nation of strangers, from his ancestral homelands. But his father, the king, and to a less obvious extent his people, assume that he will be incapable of fulfilling this prophecy because of the fact that he was born blind. In answer to the king's prayers and to his ceaseless efforts to solicit his son's cure supernaturally, an oracle reveals that if the prince can make his sacrifice before a queen who reigns in peace and honor true, he will gain the power of sight, and by implication, become capable of expelling the Spanish. At the start of the device, then, the prince stands before Elizabeth, confident in her ability to grant him what the oracle describes as the morning of his eyes. Immediately after the prince gains the power of sight, however, the device dispenses with this fiction in favor of another. Your Majesty's sacred presence hath wrought the strangest innovation that ever was in the world, the attendant to the prince explains. You have before you seeing love, a prince indeed, but of greater territories than all the Indies. This so-called innovation, in which the prince becomes or is revealed to be a version of Cupid, plays upon the ostensible resemblance of the two figures to one another. That is, the prince initially appears to be blind, like Cupid, armed after the Indian manner with a bow and arrow, and attired with feathers that recall Cupid's wings. Rather than choose between the two instantiations of the figure at the heart of the device, I want to think across them, to consider the relationship between disability and desire within the context of what Imtiaz Habib calls proto-colonialism. Proto-colonialism is a forerunner of colonialism, and something that occurs without colonization or before full colonization has formally emerged. It can be described as the collective communitarian desire to possess and remake the other that has both a predictive and substitutive relation to the material manifestation of that act in colonization proper. Proto-colonial desire, then, can be said to represent the possessive substrate of imperialism itself. As a longing to possess, it necessarily anticipates the conquests that represent the realization of that desire in the world, functioning as an erotic correlative to the act of imagining that, for Edward Said, both precedes and enables the fact of having an empire. The device expresses this longing to possess as a longing to cure, revealing what may be called the ideology of ability at the heart of English imperialism. As Tobin Siebers argues, the ideology of ability is not simply a preference for able-bodiedness. It is a conceptual framework that establishes ability as the ideological baseline by which humanness is determined. The lesser the ability, according to Siebers, the lesser the human being. Siebers' assertion that ability serves to distinguish between the human and the non-human can and should be placed in dialogue with Alexander Wahelia's influential account of racialization as a process that serves to discipline humanity into full humans, quasi-humans, and non-humans, to suggest how race and ability work in tandem with one another to determine who is truly human and thus deserving of humane treatment. Since at least the 13th century, and I suspect for far longer, Europeans have imagined indigenous peoples to be inhuman as a result of their ostensible inability. Whether marked by physical deformity, as in the Hereford Mappamundi or the Travels of John Mandeville, by intellectual incapacity, as in the writings of Christopher Columbus, Hernán Cortés, or Francisco de Vitoria, or by physical impairment, as in the device, indigenous peoples were imagined to be defined by forms of bodily and cognitive difference that rendered them a disabled race. Such marking serves as the foundation of what I am calling settler ability. As Said demonstrates in Orientalism, European imperialism in the late 18th and 19th centuries relied upon a Hegelian dialectic to construct an image of the colonial other through which the settler may know itself. Anticipating this dialectic, the the sustained effort to assert that indigenous peoples were fundamentally disabled served to define settlers as the obverse of this image, unimpaired, or more accurately, defined by a hyper-ability that enabled them to cure indigenous peoples of their supposed incapacity. In this model of settler colonization enacts a form of curative violence, a phrase that Eunjung Kim advances to describe the exercise of force to erase differences for the putative betterment of the other. Curative violence, in her words, occurs when cure is actually what frames the presence of disability as a problem and ends up destroying the subject in the curative process. What better illustration of the way that curative violence shapes settler colonialism than the infamous phrase, "kill the Indian, save the man," a distillation of the logic that led Richard Henry Pratt to found the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879. Established roughly a decade before the end of indigenous armed resistance against the United States, the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was the flagship boarding school devoted to forcibly assimilating Native children into Anglo-settler culture. Reflecting the logic of elimination that Patrick Wolfe locates at the heart of settler colonialism, Carlisle endeavored to save the human by killing, curing any trace of indigeneity. Implicit in Pratt's figuration of settler violence as a kind of cure is the assumption that white Christian Europeans, or in this instance Americans, are as a race able-bodied and able-minded, and that their capacities render them capable of curing the so-called savage. Implicit in Pratt's phrase, in other words, is the assumption of settler ability. Today I am interested in how the device stages these twin fantasies, the fiction of indigenous impairment and the fiction of settler ability, at a crucial moment in English imperialism. In the late 16th century, as England endeavored to extend its colonial project from Ireland into the Americas, the foremost advocates of Western planting looked to Spain's conquest as a model for their own colonial ambitions. They disavowed that debt through what has become known as the Black Legend, the myth that Spain was uniquely cruel in its conquest of the Americas. The English used the Black Legend to construct a sense of their own settler ability, figuring indigenous peoples across the Americas as profoundly injured or impaired by the violence of Spanish conquest and crying out for the cure of English colonialism. Written and performed to capitalize upon Walter Raleigh's first voyage to Guyana, the device not only staged the foundational coordinates of settler ability as it was being forged within the early modern Anglophone world, it also, I will suggest, revealed settler ability to be an empty fantasy, no more yielding but a dream. 1. Within the device, the prince's blindness serves as the foundation of settler ability in the metaphorical weight that it is made to bear. It is described as the only tax and imposition that fortune set upon the father's felicity and nature laid upon the son's perfections. For this want removed, never was there in that royal line a spark of that expectation, so lovely of presence, so active of body, and so full of spirit. The prince's blindness is thus the singular blemish upon an otherwise perfect body in an otherwise perfect state, a point that the device underscores in asserting that the king is a mighty monarch whose rare happiness in all things else is only eclipsed in the calamity of his son. In this way, the prince's blindness functions as a metaphor for the injury of Spanish conquest. Spain's incursions are described as a scourge that hath wound itself about the body of that continent, though it hath not pierced near the heart thereof. Here, the prince's body and the body of that continent stand in for one another, with the scourge or injury of settler colonialism being rendered as the calamity of the prince's blindness. Again, the only tax and imposition that fortune set upon the father's felicity. It is through the prince's blindness, then, that the device figures the violence of settler colonial occupation, and in turn, the inability of the Waro to save themselves from this onslaught. As such, The prince's blindness is a creative displacement or representation of the very real violence the Spanish inflicted in what Jasbir Puar has called mass impairment. In her study of Israel's occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, Puar has shown how the deliberate infliction of disability on a mass scale can function as a tactic of settler colonial occupation, in which the use of a shoot-to-cripple approach, as opposed to shoot-to-kill, serves as a means of disciplining and controlling the colonized. When such an approach is deployed, disability becomes endemic rather than exceptional, a consequence of resisting the occupation and also as merely living as occupied. Mass impairment marks the history of Spain's conquest of the Americas from the very beginning. In his Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias, translated into English as The Spanish Colony, Bartolomé de las Casas contends that the Spanish have done naught else in those parts of the Americas that they have occupied these 40 years past, nor do at this present save tear the indigenous peoples in pieces, kill them, martyr them, afflict them, torment them, and destroy them by strange sorts of cruelties never neither seen, nor read, nor heard of, the like. On the island of Hispaniola, where began the great slaughters and spoils of people, the Spanish first inflicted a genocidal violence upon the Taíno. They entered into towns, boroughs, and villages, sparing neither children, nor old men, nor women with child, neither them that lay in, but that they ripped their bellies and cut them in pieces, as if they had been opening of lambs shut up in the fold. Children were swung by the heels, their heads crushed against the cliffs, while others were hanged, burned alive, or cast into the rivers to drown. The Spanish subjected those who had survived this slaughter to mass impairment, intended to send a message to the Taíno who had escaped into the mountains. Unto all others, whom they used to take and reserve alive, cutting off their two hands as near as might be, and so letting them hang, they said, "Get you with these letters, to carry tidings to those which are fled by the mountains." As the Spanish extended their reach into nearby islands and eventually the mainland, they continued to inflict mass impairment upon the survivors of their genocidal project. In Mexico, for example, when Hernán Cortés suspected 50 Tlaxcalan men of being spies, he took all 50 and cut off their hands and sent them to tell their chief that by day or by night or whenever they chose to come, they would see who we were. Cortés's use of amputation to send a message, to ensure that those he aspires to conquer would see who we were, echoes Columbus's use of the same violence on the island of Hispaniola, intended to force the disabled to carry the tidings to those which are fled by the mountains. According to Las Casas, Pizarro's conquest of Peru unfolded with the same proceedings as all the rest before gone. He recounts how Pizarro and other Spanish conquistadors followed Columbus and Cortés in the use of mass impairment as a means of colonial subjugation. They cut the hands, the noses, and the ears of the Indians and of their women without any other cause or purpose save only that so it came into their fantasy. From Hispaniola to Mexico to Peru and beyond, these examples of mass impairment demonstrate the development of a colonial tactic in which the imposition of disability upon a colonized peoples becomes an essential tool of imperial dominion. But perhaps more profound than such mass impairment was what Puar theorizes as debilitation, the slow wearing down of indigenous populations through the destruction of traditional lifeways and the creation of colonial infrastructure. In his account of Spain's conquest of Hispaniola, Las Casas vividly describes how debilitation unfolded after the Spanish had inflicted mass impairment upon the Taíno. The Spanish imposed what Maria Mies calls a sexual division of labor, sending the men into the mines to make them drain out of gold, and the women they bestowed into the country to their farms to manure and till the ground. Las Casas notes that such farming is a sore travail, even for the very men, the ablest and mightiest, explicitly figuring that labor in terms of ability. He adds, however, that the conditions the Spanish imposed upon the men and women served to debilitate and incapacitate the surviving Taino. And I'm going to read a lengthy quotation here slowly, and I just want you to map with me the process from one step to another, because I think it demonstrates debilitation in practice. They gave to eat, neither to one nor the other, naught save grasses and such like things of no substance. In such sort as the milk of the breasts of the wives newly delivered of their childbirth dried up, and thus died in a small season all the little creatures, their young children. Further, by reason of the separation and not cohabiting of the men with their wives, the generation between them ceased. The men died with toil and famine in the minerals. These women died of the same in the fields. By these means were consumed and brought to their ends so huge a number of the folk of this island. Las Casas' account shows how debilitation, again, the slow wearing down of a population, serves the ends of capitalist accumulation. It sheds light on the violence that other forms of colonial infrastructure, from the encomienda system in Mexico and the reducciones in Peru to the mines at Potosí. Debilitation remains one of the most enduring legacies of European settler colonialism. As Waiwazetwin and Michael Yellowbird have argued, colonization not only resulted in the loss of major rights, such as land and self-determination, but most of our contemporary daily struggles, poverty, family violence, chemical dependency, suicide, and the deterioration of health, are also the direct consequences of colonization. This legacy is a reminder that settler colonialism is a structure, not an event, in Patrick Wolf's influential formulation, and that it is a structure that works to capacitate and to enable the settler through the impairment of indigenous peoples. 2. The device translates the disability and debilitation that we find within the colonial archive into an individual impairment, notably one that the English might cure. Through this translation, the device shows how indigenous impairment, whether as a discursive fiction or as a material fact, serves as the foundation for settler ability. As I've argued, settler ability is not simply the belief that settlers are more able-bodied and more able-minded than indigenous peoples, although it is that. The concept also captures how the fiction of indigenous impairment positions the settler as capable of curing indigenous peoples of their ostensible incapacity. Guided by what Robert McGruer has called compulsory able-bodiedness and its cognate, compulsory able-mindedness, settler ability expresses itself as the violent rehabilitation of the indigenous subject. Settler ability is in this way not simply posited, but performatively constituted in the act of curing. A curing, it must be noted, that serves to capacitate settlers through the acquisition of territory and the accumulation of material wealth. Unsurprisingly, as a device made for the entertainment of the Queen, the device presents Elizabeth as the embodiment of settler ability. But it also traffics in the same alignment of the body of the monarch and the body of the kingdom seen earlier in the device to figure Elizabeth's extraordinary ability as decidedly English. Elizabeth's/England's extraordinary ability is established within the device through the oracle, which tells the prince that, seated between the old world and the new, a land there is no other land may touch, where reigns a queen in peace and honor true. England's own inviolability is underscored here. It is figured as a land no other land may touch, a nod not only to England's insularity, but also its success in defeating the Armada, which spared the kingdom from the very scourge of Spanish occupation that now plagues the Indian prince and his people. In turn, Elizabeth's capacity is established not only through her own inviolability, her status as the Virgin Queen, but also through her incredible strength. Never did Atlas such a burden bear as she in holding up the world oppressed. supplying with her virtue everywhere weakness of friends, errors of servants best. Elizabeth, and in turn England, are thus defined not simply through the absence of impairment, but also as capable of curing impairment in others, holding up the world oppressed and correcting or compensating for the weakness of friends and the errors of servants. Their incapacities become the means by which Elizabeth's extraordinary ability is established, in an anticipation of, and direct parallel to, Elizabeth's miraculous cure of the Indian prince. In brief, it is through the act of curing races of people who are defined as less capable than the English that English settler ability is made manifest. In this way, the device stages an argument for settler colonialism as a kind of cure that Richard Hakluyt, George Peckham, and other advocates of Western planting began to advance in the early 1580s, when the translation of Las Casas's account furnished the English with a new way of justifying the colonization of the Americas. In a particular discourse concerning the great necessity and manifold commodities that are likely to grow to this realm of England by the Western discoveries lately attempted, better known as the Discourse of Western Planting, Hakluyt drew upon Las Casas to declare that the Spanish have executed most outrageous and more than Turkish cruelties in all the West Indies. He repeats Las Casas's claim that the Spanish have done aught else to the Taino, Mexica, the Inca, and others save to tear them in pieces, kill them, martyr them, afflict them. And as evidence, Hakluyt includes Las Casas's account of mass impairment on the island of Hispaniola. But Hakluyt describes the extent of such violence in order to figure indigenous peoples as at once eager to expel the Spanish and incapable of doing so on their own. The Spanish, he writes, are everywhere there become most odious unto them, the native people, such that they would join with us or any other most willingly to shake off their most intolerable yoke. Consider what cause the small remainder of those most afflicted Indians have to revolt from the obedience of the Spaniards, Hakluyt entreats his readers, observing that in many places they have already begun to do so of themselves without the help of any Christian prince. But Hakluyt stresses that although these people are eager, they are unable to liberate themselves on their own. True, the Indians began to search means to cast the Spaniards out of their lands and set themselves up in arms, Hakluyt writes. But what kind of arms, he asks, only to conclude, very weak and feeble to withstand or resist, and of less defense. Stressing the weak and feeble nature of indigenous arms, Hakluyt describes the native peoples of the Americas as marked by a fundamental incapacity to overthrow their oppressors. He compounds the figuration of indigenous inability by asserting that because their arms are very weak and feeble, all their wars are no more wars than the playing of children when as they play at Diogo de Cane or at reeds. For this reason, Hakluyt contends, the indigenous people long to be colonized. The people of America cry out unto us, their next neighbors, to come and help them, he writes. Here, the English are figured as uniquely capable of providing such help. Observing that Spanish cruelty has left the Americas partly ruinated, dispeopled, and laid to waste, and partly grievously infested by the Indians, Cimarrons, Moors, revolted, Hakluyt argues that Spain is easy to be driven thence only if England is willing to take its place. To that end, he contends, the indigenous peoples of the West Indies all yell and cry out with one voice, libertà, libertà, as desirous of liberty and freedom, and that they will therefore welcome the English as liberators. So no doubt whensoever the Queen of England, a prince of such clemency, shall seat upon that firm of America, and shall be reported throughout all that tract to use the natural people there with all humanity, courtesy, and freedom, they will yield themselves to her government and revolt clean from the Spaniard. The extent to which Hakluyt lays the foundation for the device is remarkable. As in the device, Hakluyt imagines a weak and feeble people unable to free themselves from the yoke of Spanish oppression. As in the device, Hakluyt imagines that the English are uniquely capable of curing such infirmity, bestowing upon an inflicted people the very thing they are unable to achieve themselves. And as in the device, Hakluyt presents such capacity as the expression of Elizabeth's inherent ability, in which the Queen of England, a prince of such clemency, uses her incredible strength to hold up the world oppressed and to cure the weakness of friends, in the language of the device itself. This, I suggest, is the ideology of ability at the heart of English imperialism, and again serves to justify the curative violence of colonialism. 3. The prince's transformation into seeing love is evidence of how much the English long for this fantasy of an impaired indigenous peoples crying out to be cured, and the extent to which they understood themselves to be capacitated by it. As Roland Green has argued, Petrarchism, the convention of writing about unrequited love derived from the work of the 14th century poet Francesco Petrarca, functioned as one of the original colonial discourses in Europe's conquest of the Americas. It provided European explorers with a conceptual framework and a vocabulary for making sense of their experiences in the Americas, where they often adopted the pose of a Petrarchan lover, longing to possess an endlessly elusive beloved in the form of the land they sought to colonize. See, for instance, Walter Raleigh's infamous assertion that Guiana is a country that hath yet her maidenhead, never sacked, turned, nor wrought, and never conquered or possessed by any Christian prince. Or John Donne's inversion of the trope in Elegy 19, where the speaker hails his beloved as, "O my America, my newfound land." In the transformation that the device enacts, wherein the central figure oscillates between being an indigenous prince and seeing love, the device draws upon, rather than invents, this eroticized discourse of conquest. But the device's innovation lies, I think, in the effect of this oscillation. When the prince transforms into seeing love, the origin or source of that desire is displaced from the colonizer onto the colonial subject, ostensibly waiting to be remade. The device thereby enacts a fantasy in which the unrequited longing of the colonizer is at last reciprocated, but only in gratitude for having been cured. In a longer version of this talk, I would have a lot more to say about seeing love and the weirdness at the end of this device. But for reasons of time, I actually want to pivot. I promised Alani this awkward transition, but here it is. Because there's something about, I've been arguing, in other words, that the device discloses an ideology of settler ability. But I want to also put pressure on what the device is doing and challenge that. And I think the easiest way of doing this is to suggest that what the device does is not only underscore settler ability, but also reveal it to be a fiction or a fantasy. And the clearest way that it does that is in the way, I think, the device was enacted. As I noted before, the device was written and performed to capitalize upon Raleigh's recent return from his first voyage to Guiana in September 1595, when he returned to England with an indigenous prince named Caio. As Raleigh writes in The Discovery of the Large, Rich, and Beautiful Empire of Guiana, he sought to forge an alliance with Topiwari, the king of Aromea, and to deal with him for some of his country, to bring with us into England, as well to learn the language as to confer withal by the way. According to Raleigh, as part of this exchange, Topiwari freely gave me his only son to take with me into England, and hoped that though he himself had but a short time to live, and that by our means his son should be established after his death. After arriving in England in September 1595, Caio remained there for several months, eventually returning to Guiana with Lawrence Kemmis in January 1596. As one of hundreds of indigenous travelers to Europe in the early modern era, Caio would therefore have been present in England at the moment the device was performed. It seems likely that Caio was not simply present at the performance of the device, but that he played a version of himself, standing in for the blind Indian prince whom Elizabeth miraculously cures. Notably, within the device, the prince himself does not speak, but has his thoughts and actions glossed by an attendant who is described as white of complexion and expert in languages. This would allow Kaya-Wariko to stand on stage, silent, and to stand in for the fictional prince who has indeed traveled to England from the great river of the Amazons. How would Kaya-Wariko's presence on stage have implicated or altered the device's performance of settler ability? In her study of the way that African and Afro-diasporic peoples were displayed in early modern England, Dimna Callahan helpfully distinguishes between two distinct, though connected, systems of representation: the display of Black people themselves, exhibition, and the simulation of Blackness, mimesis, as when, for instance, white actors adopted a kind of blackface to stage the characters of Othello and Cleopatra. If Kaya-Wariko did indeed participate in the performance of the device itself would have hovered uneasily between these two representational modes. That is, the entertainment would have turned, to a degree, upon the display or the exhibition of a living indigenous person, echoing or anticipating similar displays that Habib, Alden T. Vaughan, Cole Thrush, and other scholars have documented. But to the degree that the performance maps an elaborate fiction onto the body of an indigenous performer, demanding that that body bear the weight of two elaborate fictions, one of an Indian prince born blind, traveling in search of a miraculous cure that will enable him to expel the Spanish, and another of a Roman god using an elaborate stratagem to gain his sight, and in turn to bestow upon Elizabeth the gifts of love, the device enacts a simulation of indigeneity that renders its performance mimesis rather than exhibition. The tension between these two representational modes can be read in two ways. On the one hand, the device's willingness to interlace exhibition with mimesis risks collapsing the latter into the former. That is, crafting the English fiction of an impaired Indian onto the body of a real indigenous prince, and thus making the play's alignment of indigeneity and incapacity, the foundation of settler ability, seem all the more compelling. That is, Kaya-Wariko's bodily presence within the performance space risks substantiating the fiction of the performance itself, that such people really are incapacitated, and that the English really are obligated to cure them through conquest. But on the other hand, Kaya-Wariko's presence would have derailed the device, I think, as the fiction of the Indian prince gives way to the other fiction of seeing love. The device seems to suggest that the story of a blind Indian prince traveling from the great river of the Amazons to the English court is untrue, even within the fiction of the device. It is a stratagem used by love to procure his sight. In this rendering, the presence of Kaya-Wariko within the performance space upsets the ease with which the device attempts to do away with its initial fiction of indigeneity, to stress that underneath the figure of seeing love is an indigenous prince whose presence remains in spite of the device's attempt to pretend that he isn't there. In this second reading, Kaya-Wariko's presence functions as a version of what the Kanaka Maoli scholar J. Kanulani Kuani has called enduring indigeneity. The concept of enduring indigeneity challenges the notion that indigenous peoples have indeed been eliminated by settler colonialism to stress the ways in which they continue to exist, resist, and persist in Kuani's formulation. As an instance of enduring indigeneity, Kaya-Wariko demonstrates first and foremost the incompleteness of the device's operation, a refusal to reciprocate the proto-colonial desire that the device seems to be organized around. Above all, however, his presence is a refutation of the idea that indigenous peoples are in need of cure at all. And in exposing the lie at the heart of settler ability, Kaya-Wariko is a reminder of the importance and the urgency of challenging the fiction of settler ability in the archives of the early modern period and in its legacies in the present day.
Thank you so much. I apologize for kind of like diverging a little bit from like the exact topic that you were talking about, but I just couldn't help but think about like what you were saying about like this like settler ability, like this mindset and how it was a fiction, and connecting that to just kind of like the narrative that the United States, like the white people in the United States, like created, especially like through slavery. And I couldn't help but think about like the writings and the work of the 1619 Project and the work done by Nicole Hannah Jones, and how she made, or how like they kind of framed, or like in the United States, like they made this fiction non-fiction throughout like through like the, I don't know, like systemic laws and everything. What do you think about like considering, I don't know, just like United States history in the context of disability, if that makes any sense?
It totally makes sense. I love this question so much. Thank you. It's where I'm trying to go with this project, which is one of the reasons I included that quote or that phrase that's attributed to Richard Henry Pratt, to think about these ideas in the longue durée. I also love your point because I think it gets at one of the things I'm wrestling with in this project, which is that the idea that indigenous peoples are incapable is a fiction. It's a fiction of ability, it's a fiction of race that is strategically attributed, but it is a thing that is realized in the colonial process, or to your point, the way that structures in the United States serve to debilitate, inhibit, incapacitate, etc. So I'm trying to attend to both elements of that there's a lie here, and that lie is doing real violence, and to acknowledge the lie isn't to undermine or to forget about the structural violence, but it's important, I think, for maybe a foundation for mounting a kind of activist response. In other words, as I'm thinking through your question, I'm thinking about my own investment in this project, which is to a degree scholarly, calling out the fiction of settler ability and other fictions like white supremacy, but also that realizing that these are fictions creates obligations for us as activists to dismantle those structures. And maybe this is getting back to my question about inclusion, but it is thinking about how inclusion can be symbolic. It can be a form of access washing to make an institution seem better than it is, but it has to be structural, actually. So I hope that answers what, again, I think is a wonderful question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that question. That was great. I have so much to say, mostly wow, and also thank you. But it's going to come to no surprise to some of my students here, and also to you, that I really love what you're doing with Petrarch and Petrarchism and Donne, and I just think this is a really important reprioritization of what the elegiac, amorous voice is doing in lyric poetry. And also, I think you're really bringing to the fore how it traffics in these proto-colonial investments, even in the expression of loss and instability that can then be linked to disability. But also, as you know, I've been thinking a lot about cure and caring in rhetorically stylized ways. So your discussion of Elizabeth, I just thought was so helpful to me. But I'm also wondering if I'm also going back to the discussion you gave us about blemish and blemishing, and how that kind of presupposes a perfectible natural state, and then how we can read this kind of the rhetorical embellishment and exaggeration of Elizabeth, for example, against a natural state that, because the blemish then is not the natural. So there's kind of an interesting tension there, and I would just love to hear some of your thoughts about it. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful and such a generative question, because it helps me to think about two moments in the device or in the paper rather, that I haven't fully been able to put together, except now as I think about your question, which is that when I think about the blemish, I think of it in terms of a kind of staining. It's a racialized mark in a way, and I'm thinking here of Patricia Akini's excellent work about how racialization is a way of marking a body and marking that body as incapable of advancement, improvement, etc. And she does wonderful work around this in early modern English drama. So on the flip side of that, it would seem like natural is to be unstained, perfect, right? Except in one of the Hakluyt quotations, which I could try and find, but I'm probably not going to be able to do it quickly, when he's describing the people who need to be cured by Elizabeth, he describes them as quote-unquote natural people. And it's a way of suggesting a kind of primitiveness or an unimproved quality, again, to come back to Akini. So maybe this is a way of coming back to the first question, too. It's a way of saying the blemish seems like it's racializing. Natural people seems like it's a way of talking about intellectual ability. And those two should cut in tension with one another, but actually ideology allows us to suture them together to say, well, either they're blemished racially or they're naturally incapable, and it doesn't matter which because we're going to go colonize. So this also gets at that fiction, is that there are two registers here that don't work together, but they do within the settler mentality. So thank you.
Thank you. It probably also points out just that frustration at the cure and curarise type of divide.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. There's a reception too. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. Okay, so I guess I have a question that is like specific to your talk, but also maybe like larger about all the papers we've heard so far, which has to do with sort of like the use of very specific kind of conceptual frameworks in the present, like casting it backward into circumstances that exist before those the historical conditions arose that gave birth to those concepts. So I'm thinking about like your use of puer and debilitation, right? Which, and also I think maybe Julie Livingston is actually really the person who kind of coins that phrase in a very specific context. And I guess, it's not just about like it's not just about like the injury, right? But it's about the use of injury for the kind of recuperation and the kind of biopolitical productivity of that injury, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess I would say like, yes, I guess maybe that's what's going on in Spanish colonial context, but like it also sort of isn't in some ways. So I guess what I want to ask is like, I see how puer helps your argument, but are there ways in which it might like actually obscure other things that are going on in other dynamics? And like I guess it's just like a question about like presentism, right? And I'm not somebody who works on the pre-modern era, so I'm sure you all are thinking about this all the time. But I would just love to hear your thoughts about that, and also what some of the dangers might be of like invoking a concept like the right to maim in a context in which it was not like formulated to, address.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that's it.
Yeah, this is a really helpful and generative question. I've got a short answer and then a slightly long answer. The short answer is yes, but I don't know how. and that's why I do think that this is the beginnings of a book project. In other words, I think puer is helpful for me in trying to think about disability in the context of settler colonialism. But you're right, in working through this talk, I thought the contours of mass impairment in what we're seeing in Las Casas and Cortez are fundamentally different from what we're seeing in Israel's occupation of Gaza. And so I need to do more work in those archives to say, to what extent are we seeing the same thing? To what extent are we seeing something different? And I think the reference to Julie Livingston is also helpful here. That debilitation, it's not simply, I think, the early modern versus the contemporary. It's that the debilitation that the encomienda system enacts might probably be different from the debilitation that we see in colonial Virginia. And I just haven't had a chance to, I need to finish the one book before I can get to this, but like I want to go there. So I think it's a way of saying, and maybe this is going to Sonia's talk of thinking about the yes, but also the no. That's the no, we should think more about the nuances and the particularities. I think the yes, and why I still want to use puer, is that it does allow us to think across historical instances and modalities of settler colonialism. And that, for me, throws into the ethics of this project. In other words, this is not, for me, antiquated historicism thinking about back then. It's what is happening in Gaza is still very much on my mind as I'm trying to think through these questions. And so noting how settler colonialism then takes a different form than it does now allows us to also think through the continuities for political ends. Yeah.
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you so much. It was great. I really enjoyed your talk. I wanted to jump to Las Casas and unintended consequences, because I think, sort of thinking through what you've said, he obviously wrote his text with one specific point in mind, right? To denounce and to draw attention to. Yet what you have said suggests that it sort of backfired, right? That it somehow buttressed and legitimized what was going on. So I'm just curious if there was any talk of that, contemporaneous conversations about this within Spain, or sort of an awareness either in Spain or elsewhere of this sort of contradiction, of this sort of two ways of reading this really hyperbolic text, right? And if anyone sort of noticed it, or if anyone commented sort of on that sort of duality of the text.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I am less familiar with the history of the reception of Las Casas than I would like to be. One thing I do know is that certainly by the 20th century, the early 20th century, is when this phrase, the Black Legend, is coined as a way of naming this ideology that suggests it was only the Spanish who were extraordinarily brutal in the conquest of the Americas, and that marks them as barbaric, backward, medieval, as opposed to the modern English. My sense, my suspicion off the top of my head, again, this is speculation, is that in early modern Spain around this time, there was far more concern about Francis Drake and his ability to enact incursions on what the Spanish are doing across the Americas than in the reception around Las Casas. I would need to think more about that, but also, just as a quick point, where I go for unintended consequences with Las Casas is his argument that the Spanish should be more humane in their treatment of indigenous peoples, and that they should rely on enslaved Africans instead. And the long history of that is also just absolutely extraordinary. So again, it brings us back to these questions of like how humanness is demarcated and what it means to include some within the fold while pushing others out, so that a colonial project of racial capitalism can continue to unfold. Yeah, thank you. All right.